Welcome back. Just to recap, we're juggling those 3 balls, and we just looked at how the old way of looking at pain tends to be a straight line where it didn't explain a lot of things. The new way of looking at pain, it's quite the diagram. I hope you've looked at it a few times. Don't get overwhelmed by it, because we're going to refer back to it many times so that we start to get that solid idea of how our pain journey has created that type of picture. All right. So today, this session, we're going to talk about the 3 Musketeers. All right. So when we head into the book, we are now looking at page 25. Okay. Sorry, 23. So we're looking at the protection systems, and I've talked about protection systems already, and there's different systems in the body that contribute. But in terms of what we're looking at today, we're looking at 3 specific protection systems, okay? The 3 specific protection systems are the immune response, the immune musketeer, okay? The movement musketeer, and the hormone musketeer. All 3 of these guys play into how we're looking at that resetting and reconnecting ball. And the more we understand them, the more we can look at how things that we see as habits may or may not be contributing to our pain experience. So as we look through this, these 3 musketeers are always at work. And when they get out of whack, you're going to find that one of them starts working a little bit harder than another. All right. So let's go on and start with the immune musketeer. Okay. We've got this little guy. The immune musketeer works in 2 ways. Okay. The first way it works, and you've likely experienced this in your life, is that when you have an injury, whether you sprain your ankle, you slam your finger in a car door, you work too hard, your shoulder hurts, this local immune response, okay, it goes to the site. And what happens is there's swelling. That swelling is there because there is a response that brings in more fluids. It brings in more blood cells. It brings in everything. This local inflammation brings in everything to help heal tissue damage, right? And it's a protective response because you probably noticed if something swells up, you don't move it as much. When you give it that rest, that immediate acute rest of an injury, that immune response goes in, brings in all those different cells pieces that help heal those tissues, and then you can start moving it better. Okay? Now, here's the thing. We've been told for years that if something is swelling, we need ice. Okay, if something hurts, we need ice. And we've all heard of that RICE, rest, ice, compression, elevation. That has changed. I want you to kind of wrap your head around the idea that because of that icing response, you will be taking away some of that inflammation, that helpful inflammation. Now, in a local response, like you sprain your ankle, you take that inflammation away, it won't necessarily heal as well. So there is a new recommendation in terms of injury, and it's called peace and love. And I can write it down in the book. It's pretty intense in terms of what you need to do. Really, it's protection and compression and elevation and avoiding anti-inflammatories. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But in terms of the ice aspect, go by these 2 rules. 1, if it hurts, yeah, you can put ice on it, but don't ice for really more than 5 minutes. And that's just really to reduce your pain if it's that bad. If you're icing to reduce inflammation, that means it's something like a knee replacement where you need to get the range of movement happening, which means you need to reduce your inflammation to get the range of movement happening. Ice, for any other reason, might not be that helpful because we need that immune response. If you have any questions about that, please let me know, because we all grew up. Even now, kids grow up and this new study came out in 2020. So it's only been 4 years. Think of how many years it took for this information to come out. This is a solid 20 years. This is only 4 years old. So when you do go to ice something that hurts, just take a quick check in your mind. Are you icing it because it's painful and you want some relief? Okay, go for that 5 minutes. Are you icing it because you need that range of movement to be able to do what you need to do? Okay, go ahead and ice it. That's usually about a 15-20 minute ice. If it's anything in the middle, we need to kind of notice what we're doing with that, because the more we reduce that inflammation, the more those repair responses don't work as well. Same thing goes, as I mentioned, for anti-inflammatories. Okay? Anti-inflammatories are meant to be a temporary thing. When you use anti-inflammatories consistently, especially for persistent pain, but they've shown, there's actually a study done that showed when you use anti-inflammatories long term, it is highly more likely you are going to end up with chronic pain. Those anti-inflammatories go in the bottom. That initial acute immune response, that's one location, is now diminished, and you don't get the same tissue rebuilding. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. But this all ties in to our immune musketeer, all right? So immunity, or that immune response, I should say, is helpful. We have a virus inside our body, same thing happens. The immune musketeer goes in and surrounds that virus, ideally, with a bunch of white cells that are going to help fight it, and then we start getting better. All right, so we looked at the local immunity, right? The body-wide immune response. And we want to pay attention that when that body-wide immune response is triggered, that can tie in with stress. So stress can get that body-wide immune response triggered, which means when your back pain hits at work and you're under a lot of load, we end up with this body-wide response, all right? When we look at those anti-inflammatories, those are meant for acute locations because they're meant to deal with one specific location in terms of how they work in our body. They're not meant to deal with that body-wide inflammation, okay? Now, everything that I just said, here's an action moment, okay? Clapboard, right? I want you to sit down and write out how you feel about this information that you just learned, okay? How we can, A, look at the difference between a local immunity response, a body-wide immunity response, how that might tie into our pain experience. I want you to kind of look at how you feel about that information I gave you about icing, okay? Because icing something we're just so used to doing. So it's not that you need to avoid it. Like I said, if you want to use ice to kind of reduce your pain, totally do it, 5 minutes. But when we're doing it all the time, we're kind of reversing that idea that the body needs an immune response, okay? So the immune musketeer ramps up body-wide activity if we have lost a loved one, are constantly under threat from a bully, have unreasonable time pressures at work, financial threats, or anything else that can affect our well-being. So push pause now, okay? Write down how this information makes you think about what might be affecting you. Balance beam, right? When the immune musketeer is working too hard, we end up with a lot of joint issues, gut issues, right? Have you ever heard when you go get an x-ray that you have a lot of inflammation, but the joint itself is okay? Okay, that's that higher body-wide immune response. And that's when that immune musketeer is working too hard. It could also flip the other way, where that immune musketeer isn't working at all. And that's when we succumb to different viruses and illnesses. We want to keep it in that level playing field. Now, it's going to fluctuate a little bit here and there, but think about how you can keep that immune response, and that is that resetting level. Because if you're in persistent pain, there's a good chance your immune musketeer is way up here going, I'm fighting as hard as I can for you. And then the joints hurt and the muscles hurt, right? We want it balanced. We don't want to dip it too low either, because when we end up with sickness, right? So That's the immune musketeer. Let's talk about the hormone musketeer. Okay, and the hormones that we talk about in this book, because hormones, that adrenaline is vital to keeping us alive. Remember, you've heard fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, so the hormone musketeer talks about the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, cortisol, insulin, testosterone, estrogen. Here in this book, we're talking about adrenaline and cortisol. All right, because with adrenaline, you can imagine yourself sitting in your car, someone cuts you off, you get road rage. We get this response: fight, flight, or freeze. Back a few thousand years ago, that would help us have that energy, that boost to do what we needed to do to survive: fight, flight, or freeze. So we would have an outlet for that. Today, we don't have an outlet for it, right? We're sitting in our car and we're sitting there for another 30 minutes and we got mad, we had the reaction, but we didn't have an outlet. Now, adrenaline gives us that boost, and that can happen with any stressor in life now. If you think about how society is going and how we have all these different stresses and overloads and conflicts, those all are things that can create that adrenaline. Now, cortisol, if you think of adrenaline as the match that lights, okay, that's the part that lights the match. Cortisol is the one that keeps it burning, all right? So cortisol is that keeps that protective system on longer, but it's not as responsive. But when you have cortisol in your body at that level for long periods of time, it doesn't work so well because, and here's the reason that we want to balance all this out, is because when cortisol is in our body at a higher level than it should be, it puts our normal systems on pause. Okay, our digestive system, it slows it down. So you might end up with gut issues. It slows down your immune response. It slows down your brain. Okay, it slows down reproduction. It slows down like so many different things, healing. So when we're looking at this and we think, oh, well, I have brain fog all the time, that could be a response to that higher level cortisol. If you have gut issues, it could be that response of stress, of that adrenaline, oh, this isn't working, that higher level of cortisol happening all the time, which will slow down your digestive system, doesn't work as well. So these are things that we want to learn to be aware of, because they're all going to tie in together as we go through the book. Now, the last musketeer is our movement musketeer. The movement musketeer, just like if you fight, flight, or freeze, okay, it helps get you moving. It's also, you can think about it, if you're injured, your body is going to adjust to compensate one side or the other, or in a gait pattern, or if your arm hurts, things are going to adjust so that it takes over. Right? If your left knee hurts, your right leg is likely going to be doing more work, more balancing. That's that movement musketeer. Now, the quality of our movements depends on the quality of our communication between the brain and the rest of the body. So when we talk about this movement musketeer, if we've had ankle pain for a long time, you've likely changed your gait pattern. If you've had back pain for a long time, you've likely changed your gait pattern, maybe how you sit, maybe how you sleep. But what I want you to kind of understand is that in that change, our movement patterns don't communicate the same. So one of the things that we start working on is this graded motor imagery. And I've talked about this already, right? Where I had that client with shoulder pain who would go to the ballet, see dancers, and her shoulder would hurt. This is where that system has become too protective, overprotective. And that movement musketeer goes, oh, look at them move. Don't do that, like that's gonna hurt, and we get signals, so it becomes overprotective. Same thing can happen in your lower back. And this is where, when we work on lower back pain, we do want to move the back and create awareness of how it moves. We want to reduce the tension we hold in our lower back, and we want to build proper communication between our brain and our lower back, because the movement goes, whoa, no. And you've probably heard a strong core protects our back, right? So we think our movement musketeer goes, that's right. You know what? We're not going to move our back. We're going to have a strong core and we're going to keep it tight all the time. And you've probably heard me already say that tension in your core can put compression in your back and create more sensation. So we need to work on finding the same balance with that movement musketeer, because if he's overprotective, okay, we hold a lot of tension. Okay, if he's balanced, we're doing movement, we're doing loading, we're listening to our body. If he's not moving, right, that creates atrophy, that creates less stability, less health in our joints, in our muscles, in our tissues. Movement is a key part of this program. And that's why I want you doing those movement videos as well as these learning videos, all right? So movement in and of itself is the best way to get the body healthy, right? We know that, but it's not easy because, like I mentioned, kinesiophobia, the idea of doing movement, oh, it just sounds like it'll hurt so much. All right. So I have another action item for you, all right? What happens if the musketeers are left turned on? This is going to be a recall and recap of what we just talked about. So I want you to open up your notebook. I'm going to give you the clapboard, right? And answer these 3 questions, okay? Question number 1, a turned up and edgy immune musketeer can cause what? If that movement or that immune musketeer is really ramped up and we have that body-wide inflammation, what could we end up with? Question number 2, a turned up and edgy hormone musketeer. We have high levels of cortisol running through our body all the time. What can we end up with? Question number 3, that turned up and edgy movement musketeer and it's trying to protect us and we have this tension. What can we end up with? All right. So think about those 3 questions, hit pause, clapperboard, and I'll see you in the next video.